The Man in the Iron Mask, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 43. Explanations by Aramis. What I have to say to you, friend Porthos, will probably surprise you, but it may prove instructive.
I like to be surprised, said Porthos in a kindly tone. Do not spare me, therefore, I beg. I am hardened against emotions. Don't fear, speak out.
It is difficult, Porthos, difficult, for in truth I warn you a second time, I have very strange things, very extraordinary things to tell you.
Oh, you speak so well, my friend, that I could listen to you for days together. Speak, then, I beg, and stop, I have an idea. I will, to make your task more easy, I will, to assist you in telling me such things, question you.
I shall be pleased at your doing so.
What are we going to fight for, Aramis?
If you ask me many such questions as that, if you would render my talk the easier by interrupting my revelations thus, Porthos, you will not help me at all. So far, on the contrary, that is the very Gordian knot. But, my friend, with a man like you, good, generous, and devoted, the confession must be bravely made. I have deceived you, my worthy friend.
You have deceived me.
Good heavens, yes.
Was it for my good, Aramis?
I thought so, Porthos. I thought so sincerely, my friend.
Then,
said the honest seigneur of Bracieux,
you have rendered me a service, and I thank you for it. For if you had not deceived me, I might have deceived myself. In what, then, have you deceived me? Tell me.
In that I was serving the usurper against whom Louis XIV. At this moment is directing his efforts.
The usurper,
said Porthos, scratching his head.
That is, well, I do not quite clearly comprehend.
He is one of the two kings who are contending for the crown of France.
Very well. Then you were serving him who is not Louis XIV?
You have hit the matter in one word.
It follows that...
It follows that we are rebels, my poor friend.
The devil! The devil!
Cried Porthos, much disappointed. Oh, but, dear Porthos, be calm. We shall still find means of getting out of the affair, trust me.
It is not that which makes me uneasy, replied Porthos. That which alone touches me is that ugly word, rebels.
Ah, but...
And so, according to this, the duchy that was promised me...
It was the usurper that was to give it to you.
And that is not the same thing, Aramis, said Porthos majestically.
My friend, if it had only depended upon me, you should have become a prince. Porthos began to bite his nails in a melancholy way.
That is where you have been wrong, continued he, in deceiving me, for that promised duchy I reckoned upon. Oh, I reckoned upon it seriously, knowing you to be a man of your word, Aramis.
Poor Porthos, pardon me, I implore you.
So then,
continued Porthos, without replying to the bishop's prayer,
so then it seems I have quite fallen out with Louis XIV?
Oh, I will settle all that, my good friend. I will settle all that. I will take it on myself alone.
Aramis!
No, no, Porthos, I conjure you, let me act. No false generosity, no inopportune devotedness. You knew nothing of my projects. You have done nothing of yourself. With me, it is different. I alone am the author of this plot. I stood in need of my inseparable companion. I called upon you, and you came to me in remembrance of our ancient device, all for one, one for all. My crime is that I was an egotist.
Now that is a word I like, said Porthos. And seeing that you have acted entirely for yourself, it is impossible for me to blame you. It is natural.
and upon this sublime reflection Porthos pressed his friend's hand cordially. In presence of this ingenuous greatness of soul, Aramis felt his own littleness. It was the second time he had been compelled to bend before real superiority of heart, which is more imposing than brilliancy of mind. He replied by a mute and energetic pressure to the endearment of his friend. "Now," said Porthos, "that we have come to an explanation, now that I am perfectly aware of our situation with respect to Louis XIV, I think, my friend, it is time to make me comprehend the political intrigue of which we are the victims. For I plainly see there is a political intrigue at the bottom of all this." "D'Artagnan, my good Porthos, D'Artagnan is coming, and will detail it to you in all its circumstances. But, excuse me, I am deeply grieved. I am bowed down with mental anguish, and I have need of all my presence of mind, all my powers of reflection, to extricate you from the false position in which I have so imprudently involved you. But nothing can be more clear, nothing more plain than your position henceforth. The King Louis XIV has no longer now but one enemy. That enemy is myself alone. I have made you a prisoner. You have followed me. Today I liberate you. You fly back to your prince. You can perceive, Porthos, there is not one difficulty in all this." "Do you think so?" said Porthos. "I am quite sure of it." "Then why," said the admirable good sense of Porthos, "then why, if we are in such an easy position, why, my friend, do we prepare cannon, muskets, and engines of all sorts? It seems to me it would be much more simple to say to Captain d'Artagnan, 'My dear friend, we have been mistaken. That error is to be repaired. Open the door to us, let us pass through, and we will say good bye.'" "Ah, that!" said Aramis, shaking his head. "Why do you say that? Do you not approve of my plan, my friend?" "I see a difficulty in it." "What is it?" "The hypothesis that D'Artagnan may come with orders which will oblige us to defend ourselves." "What! Defend ourselves against D'Artagnan? Ah, folly! Against the good D'Artagnan!" Aramis once more replied by shaking his head. "Porthos," at length said he, "if I have had the matches lighted and the guns pointed, if I have had the signal of alarm sounded, if I have called every man to his post upon the ramparts, those good ramparts of Belle Isle which you have so well fortified, it was not for nothing. Wait to judge, or rather, no, do not wait." "What can I do?" "If I knew, my friend, I would have told you." "But there is one thing much more simple than defending ourselves. A boat, and away for France, where—" "My dear friend," said Aramis, smiling with a strong shade of sadness, "do not let us reason like children. Let us be men in council and in execution. But hark! I hear a hail for landing at the port. Attention, Porthos, serious attention." "It is D'Artagnan, no doubt," said Porthos in a voice of thunder, approaching the parapet. "Yes, it is I," replied the captain of the musketeers, running lightly up the steps of the mole, and gaining rapidly the little esplanade on which his two friends waited for him. As soon as he came towards them, Porthos and Aramis observed an officer who followed D'Artagnan, treading apparently in his very steps. The captain stopped upon the stairs of the mole when halfway up. His companions imitated him. "Make your men draw back," cried D'Artagnan to Porthos and Aramis. "Let them retire out of hearing." This order, given by Porthos, was executed immediately. Then D'Artagnan, turning towards him, who followed him, "Monsieur," said he, "we are no longer on board the king's fleet, where, in virtue of your order, you spoke so arrogantly to me just now." "Monsieur," replied the officer, "I did not speak arrogantly to you. I simply, but rigorously obeyed instructions. I was commanded to follow you. I follow you. I am directed not to allow you to communicate with any one without taking cognizance of what you do. I am in duty bound, accordingly, to overhear your conversations." D'Artagnan trembled with rage, and Porthos and Aramis, who heard this dialogue, trembled likewise, but with uneasiness and fear. D'Artagnan, biting his mustache with that vivacity which denoted in him exasperation, closely to be followed by an explosion, approached the officer. "Monsieur," said he, in a low voice, so much the more impressive, that, affecting calm, it threatened tempest. "Monsieur, when I sent a canoe hither, you wished to know what I wrote to the defenders of Belle Isle. You produced an order to that effect, and in my turn I instantly showed you the note I had written. When the skipper of the boat sent by me returned, when I received the reply of these two gentlemen," and he pointed to Aramis and Porthos, "you heard every word of what the messenger said. All that was plainly in your orders, all that was well executed, very punctually, was it not?" "Yes, monsieur," stammered the officer. "Yes, without doubt, but monsieur," continued D'Artagnan, growing warm, "monsieur, when I manifested the intention of quitting my vessel to cross to Belle Isle, you demanded to accompany me. I did not hesitate, I brought you with me. You are now at Belle Isle, are you not?" "Yes, monsieur, but the question no longer is of Monsieur Colbert, who has given you that order, or of whomsoever in the world you are following the instructions. The question now is of a man who is a clog upon Monsieur d'Artagnan, and who is alone with Monsieur d'Artagnan upon steps whose feet are bathed by 30 feet of salt water. A bad position for that man, a bad position, monsieur, I warn you." "But, monsieur, if I am a restraint upon you," said the officer, timidly and almost faintly, "it is my duty which—" "Monsieur, you have had the misfortune, either you or those that sent you, to insult me. It is done. I cannot seek redress from those who employ you. They are unknown to me, or are at too great a distance. But you are under my hand, and I swear that if you make one step behind me when I raise my feet to go up to those gentlemen, I swear to you by my name, I will cleave your head in two with my sword, and pitch you into the water. Oh, it will happen, it will happen. I have only been 6 times angry in my life, monsieur, and all 5 preceding times I killed my man." The officer did not stir. He became pale under this terrible threat, but replied with simplicity, "Monsieur, you are wrong in acting against my orders." Porthos and Aramis, mute and trembling at the top of the parapet, cried to the musketeer, "Good D'Artagnan, take care!" D'Artagnan made them a sign to keep silence, raised his foot with ominous calmness to mount the stair, and turned round, sword in hand, to see if the officer followed him. The officer made a sign of the cross, and stepped up. Porthos and Aramis, who knew their D'Artagnan, uttered a cry, and rushed down to prevent the blow they thought they already heard. But D'Artagnan passed his sword into his left hand. "Monsieur," said he to the officer, in an agitated voice, "you are a brave man. You will all the better comprehend what I am going to say to you now." "Speak, Monsieur d'Artagnan, speak," replied the officer. "These gentlemen we have just seen, and against whom you have orders, are my friends." "I know they are, monsieur." "You can understand whether or not I ought to act towards them as your instructions prescribe." "I understand your reserve." "Very well. Permit me, then, to converse with them without a witness." "Monsieur d'Artagnan, if I yield to your request, if I do that which you beg me, I break my word; but if I do not do it, I disoblige you. I prefer the one dilemma to the other. Converse with your friends, and do not despise me, monsieur, for doing this for your sake, whom I esteem and honor. Do not despise me for committing for you, and you alone, an unworthy act." D'Artagnan, much agitated, threw his arm round the neck of the young man, and then went up to his friends. The officer, enveloped in his cloak, sat down on the damp, weed-covered steps. "Well," said D'Artagnan to his friends, "such is my position, judge for yourselves." All three embraced as in the glorious days of their youth. "What is the meaning of all these preparations?" said Porthos. "You ought to have a suspicion of what they signify," said D'Artagnan. "Not any, I assure you, my dear captain; for, in fact, I have done nothing. No more has Aramis," the worthy baron hastened to say. D'Artagnan darted a reproachful look at the prelate, which penetrated that hardened heart. "Dear Porthos!" cried the bishop of Vannes. "You see what is being done against you," said D'Artagnan. "Interception of all boats coming to or going from Belle Isle. Your means of transport seized. If you had endeavored to fly, you would have fallen into the hands of the cruisers that plow the sea in all directions, on the watch for you. The king wants you to be taken, and he will take you." D'Artagnan tore at his gray mustache. Aramis grew somber, Porthos angry. "My idea was this," continued D'Artagnan, "to make you both come on board, to keep you near me, and restore you your liberty. But now, who can say, when I return to my ship, I may not find a superior, that I may not find secret orders which will take from me my command, and give it to another, who will dispose of me and you without hope of help?" "We must remain at Belle Isle," said Aramis, resolutely, "and I assure you, for my part, I will not surrender easily." Porthos said nothing. D'Artagnan remarked the silence of his friend. "I have another trial to make of this officer, of this brave fellow who accompanies me, and whose courageous resistance makes me very happy, for it denotes an honest man, who, though an enemy, is 1,000 times better than a complacent coward. Let us try to learn from him what his instructions are, and what his orders permit or forbid." "Let us try," said Aramis. D'Artagnan went to the parapet, leaned over towards the steps of the mole, and called the officer, who immediately came up. "Monsieur," said D'Artagnan, after having exchanged the cordial courtesies natural between gentlemen who know and appreciate each other, "Monsieur, if I wished to take away these gentlemen from here, what would you do?" "I should not oppose it, monsieur; but having direct explicit orders to put them under guard, I should detain them." "Ah!" said D'Artagnan. "That's all over," said Aramis, gloomily. Porthos did not stir. "But still take Porthos," said the bishop of Vannes. "He can prove to the king, and I will help him do so, and you too, Monsieur d'Artagnan, that he had nothing to do with this affair." Said D'Artagnan. "Will you come? Will you follow me, Porthos? The king is merciful." "I want time for reflection," said Porthos. "You will remain here, then?" "Until fresh orders," said Aramis, with vivacity. "Until we have an idea," resumed D'Artagnan, "and I now believe that will not be long, for I have one already." "Let us say adieu, then," said Aramis. "But in truth, my good Porthos, you ought to go." "No," said the latter, laconically. "As you please," replied Aramis, a little wounded in his susceptibilities at the morose tone of his companion. "Only I am reassured by the promise of an idea from D'Artagnan, an idea I fancy I have divined." "Let us see," said the musketeer, placing his ear near Aramis's mouth. The latter spoke several words rapidly, to which D'Artagnan replied, That is it, precisely." "Infallible!" cried Aramis. "During the first emotion this resolution will cause, take care of yourself, Aramis." "Oh, don't be afraid." "Now, monsieur," said D'Artagnan to the officer, "thanks, 1,000 thanks. You have made yourself 3 friends for life." "Yes," added Aramis. Porthos alone said nothing, but merely bowed. D'Artagnan, having tenderly embraced his 2 old friends, left Belle Isle with the inseparable companion with whom M. Colbert had saddled him. Thus, with the exception of the explanation with which the worthy Porthos had been willing to be satisfied, nothing had changed in appearance in the fate of one or the other. "Only," said Aramis, "there is D'Artagnan's idea." D'Artagnan did not return on board without profoundly analyzing the idea he had discovered. Now, we know that whatever D'Artagnan did examine, according to custom, daylight was certain to illuminate. As to the officer, now grown mute again, he had full time for meditation. Therefore, on putting his foot on board his vessel, moored within cannon shot of the island, the captain of the musketeers had already got together all his means, offensive and defensive. He immediately assembled his council, which consisted of the officers serving under his orders. These were 8 in number, a chief of the maritime forces, a major directing the artillery, an engineer, the officer we are acquainted with, and 4 lieutenants. Having assembled them, D'Artagnan arose, took off his hat, and addressed them thus: "Gentlemen, I have been to reconnoiter Belle Isle en Mer, and I have found in it a good and solid garrison. Moreover, preparations are made for a defense that may prove troublesome. I therefore intend to send for 2 of the principal officers of the place, that we may converse with them. Having separated them from their troops and cannon, we shall be better able to deal with them, particularly by reasoning with them. Is not this your opinion, gentlemen?" The major of artillery rose. "Monsieur," said he, with respect but firmness, "I have heard you say that the place is preparing to make a troublesome defense. The place is then, as you know, determined on rebellion?" D'Artagnan was visibly put out by this reply, but he was not the man to allow himself to be subdued by a trifle, and resumed: "Monsieur," said he, "your reply is just, but you are ignorant that Belle Isle is a fief of M. Fouquet's, and that former monarchs gave the right to the seigneurs of Belle Isle to arm their people." The major made a movement. "Oh, do not interrupt me," continued D'Artagnan. "You are going to tell me that that right to arm themselves against the English was not a right to arm themselves against their king. But it is not M. Fouquet, I suppose, who holds Belle Isle at this moment, since I arrested M. Fouquet the day before yesterday. Now the inhabitants and defenders of Belle Isle know nothing of this arrest. You would announce it to them in vain. It is a thing so unheard of and extraordinary, so unexpected, that they would not believe you. A Breton serves his master, and not his masters. He serves his master till he has seen him dead. Now the Bretons, as far as I know, have not seen the body of M. Fouquet. It is not then surprising they hold out against that which is neither M. Fouquet nor his signature." The major bowed in token of assent. "That is why," continued D'Artagnan, "I propose to cause 2 of the principal officers of the garrison to come on board my vessel. They will see you, gentlemen; they will see the forces we have at our disposal; they will consequently know to what they have to trust, and the fate that attends them, in case of rebellion. We will affirm to them, upon our honor, that M. Fouquet is a prisoner, and that all resistance can only be prejudicial to them. We will tell them that at the first cannon fired, there will be no further hope of mercy from the king. Then, or so at least I trust, they will resist no longer. They will yield up without fighting, and we shall have a place given up to us in a friendly way, which it might cost prodigious efforts to subdue." The officer who had followed D'Artagnan to Belle Isle was preparing to speak, but D'Artagnan interrupted him. Yes, I know what you are going to tell me, monsieur. I know that there is an order of the king's to prevent all secret communications with the defenders of Belle Isle, and that is exactly why I do not offer to communicate except in presence of my staff." And D'Artagnan made an inclination of the head to his officers, who knew him well enough to attach a certain value to the condescension. The officers looked at each other as if to read each other's opinions in their eyes, with the intention of evidently acting, should they agree, according to the desire of D'Artagnan. And already the latter saw with joy that the result of their consent would be sending a bark to Porthos and Aramis, when the king's officer drew from a pocket a folded paper, which he placed in the hands of D'Artagnan. This paper bore upon its superscription the number 1. "What, more?" murmured the surprised captain. "Read, monsieur," said the officer, with a courtesy that was not free from sadness. D'Artagnan, full of mistrust, unfolded the paper and read these words: "Prohibition to Monsieur d'Artagnan to assemble any council whatever, or to deliberate in any way before Belle Isle be surrendered and the prisoners shot. Signed, Louis." D'Artagnan repressed the quiver of impatience that ran through his whole body, and with a gracious smile, "That is well, monsieur," said he. "The king's orders shall be complied with." End of chapter. The Man in the Iron Mask, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 44. Result of the ideas of the king and the ideas of D'Artagnan. The blow was direct. It was severe, mortal. D'Artagnan, furious at having been anticipated by an idea of the king's, did not despair, however, even yet, and reflecting upon the idea he had brought back from Belle Isle, he elicited therefrom novel means of safety for his friends. "Gentlemen," said he, suddenly, "since the king has charged some other than myself with his secret orders, it must be because I no longer possess his confidence, and I should really be unworthy of it if I had the courage to hold a command subject to so many injurious suspicions. Therefore I will go immediately and carry my resignation to the king. I tender it before you all, enjoining you all to fall back with me upon the coast of France, in such a way as not to compromise the safety of the forces his majesty has confided to me. For this purpose, return all to your posts. Within an hour we shall have the ebb of the tide. To your posts, gentlemen. I suppose," added he, on seeing that all prepared to obey him, except the surveillant officer, "you have no orders to object this time?" And D'Artagnan almost triumphed while speaking these words. This plan would prove the safety of his friends. The blockade once raised, they might embark immediately, and set sail for England or Spain, without fear of being molested. Whilst they were making their escape, D'Artagnan would return to the king, would justify his return by the indignation which the mistrust of Colbert had raised in him. He would be sent back with full powers, and he would take Belle Isle, that is to say, the cage, after the birds had flown. But to this plan the officer opposed a further order of the king's. It was thus conceived: "From the moment M. d'Artagnan shall have manifested the desire of giving in his resignation, he shall no longer be reckoned leader of the expedition, and every officer placed under his orders shall be held to no longer obey him. Moreover, the said M. d'Artagnan, having lost that quality of leader of the army sent against Belle Isle, shall set out immediately for France, accompanied by the officer who will have remitted the message to him, and who will consider him a prisoner for whom he is answerable." Brave and careless as he was, D'Artagnan turned pale. Everything had been calculated with a depth of precognition which, for the first time in 30 years, recalled to him the solid foresight and inflexible logic of the great cardinal. He leaned his head on his hand, thoughtful, scarcely breathing. "If I were to put this order in my pocket," thought he, "who would know it? What would prevent my doing it? Before the king had had time to be informed, I should have saved those poor fellows yonder. Let us exercise some small audacity. My head is not one of those the executioner strikes off for disobedience. We will disobey." But at the moment he was about to adopt this plan, he saw the officers around him reading similar orders, which the passive agent of the thoughts of that infernal Colbert had distributed to them. This contingency of his disobedience had been foreseen, as all the rest had been. "Monsieur," said the officer, coming up to him, "I await your good pleasure to depart." "I am ready, monsieur," replied D'Artagnan, grinding his teeth. The officer immediately ordered a canoe to receive M. d'Artagnan and himself. At sight of this he became almost distraught with rage. "How," stammered he, "will you carry on the directions of the different corps?" "When you are gone, monsieur," replied the commander of the fleet, "it is to me the command of the whole is committed." "Then, monsieur," rejoined Colbert's man, addressing the new leader, "it is for you that this last order remitted to me is intended. Let us see your powers." "Here they are," said the officer, exhibiting the royal signature. "Here are your instructions," replied the officer, placing the folded paper in his hands, and turning round towards D'Artagnan. "Come, monsieur," said he, in an agitated voice, such despair did he behold in that man of iron, "do me the favor to depart at once." "Immediately," articulated D'Artagnan, feebly, subdued, crushed by implacable impossibility. And he painfully subsided into the little boat, which started, favored by wind and tide, for the coast of France. The king's guards embarked with him. The musketeer still preserved the hope of reaching Nantes quickly, and of pleading the cause of his friends eloquently enough to incline the king to mercy. The bark flew like a swallow. D'Artagnan distinctly saw the land of France profiled in black against the white clouds of night. "Ah, monsieur," said he in a low voice to the officer to whom, for an hour, he had ceased speaking, "what would I give to know the instructions for the new commander? They are all pacific, are they not? And—" He did not finish. The thunder of a distant cannon rolled athwart the waves, another, and two or three still louder. D'Artagnan shuddered. "They have commenced the siege of Belle Isle," replied the officer. The canoe had just touched the soil of France. End of chapter. The Man in the Iron Mask, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 45. The Ancestors of Porthos. When D'Artagnan left Aramis and Porthos, the latter returned to the principal fort, in order to converse with greater liberty. Porthos, still thoughtful, was a restraint on Aramis, whose mind had never felt itself more free. "Dear Porthos," said he suddenly, "I will explain D'Artagnan's idea to you." "What idea, Aramis?" "An idea to which we shall owe our liberty within 12 hours." "Ah, indeed!" said Porthos, much astonished. "Let us hear it." "Did you remark, in the scene our friend had with the officer, that certain orders constrained him with regard to us?" "Yes, I did notice that." "Well, D'Artagnan is going to give in his resignation to the king, and during the confusion that will result from his absence, we will get away, or rather, you will get away, Porthos, if there is possibility of flight for only one." Here Porthos shook his head, and replied, "We will escape together, Aramis, or we will stay together." "Thine is a generous heart," said Aramis. "Only your melancholy uneasiness affects me." "I am not uneasy," said Porthos. "Then you are angry with me?" "I am not angry with you." "Then why, my friend, do you put on such a dismal countenance?" "I will tell you. I am making my will." and while saying these words, the good Porthos looked sadly in the face of Aramis. "Your will!" cried the bishop. "What, then? Do you think yourself lost?" "I feel fatigued. It is the first time, and there is a custom in our family." "What is it, my friend?" "My grandfather was a man twice as strong as I am." "Indeed!" said Aramis. "Then your grandfather must have been Samson himself." "No, his name was Antoine. Well, he was about my age, when setting out one day for the chase, he felt his legs weak, the man who had never known what weakness was before." "What was the meaning of that fatigue, my friend?" "Nothing good, as you will see; for having set out, complaining still of weakness of the legs, he met a wild boar, which made head against him. He missed him with his arquebus, and was ripped up by the beast and died immediately." "There is no reason in that why you should alarm yourself, dear Porthos." "Oh, you will see. My father was as strong again as I am. He was a rough soldier, under Henry III. And Henry IV. His name was not Antoine, but Gaspard, the same as M. de Coligny. Always on horseback, he had never known what lassitude was. One evening, as he rose from table, his legs failed him." "He had supped heartily, perhaps," said Aramis, "and that was why he staggered." "Bah! A friend of M. de Bassompierre? Nonsense! No, no. He was astonished at this lassitude, and said to my mother, who laughed at him, 'Would not one believe I was going to meet with a wild boar, as the late M. de Vallon, my father, did?'" "Well?" said Aramis. "Well, having this weakness, my father insisted upon going down into the garden, instead of going to bed. His foot slipped on the first stair. The staircase was steep. My father fell against a stone in which an iron hinge was fixed. The hinge gashed his temple, and he was stretched out dead upon the spot." Aramis raised his eyes to his friend. "These are two extraordinary circumstances," said he. "Let us not infer that there may succeed a third. It is not becoming in a man of your strength to be superstitious, my brave Porthos. Besides, when were your legs known to fail? Never have you stood so firm, so haughtily. Why, you could carry a house on your shoulders." "At this moment," said Porthos, "I feel myself pretty active, but at times I vacillate, I sink, and lately this phenomenon, as you say, has occurred 4 times. I will not say this frightens me, but it annoys me. Life is an agreeable thing. I have money, I have fine estates, I have horses that I love, I have also friends that I love. D'Artagnan, Athos, Raoul, and you." The admirable Porthos did not even take the trouble to dissimulate in the very presence of Aramis the rank he gave him in his friendship. Aramis pressed his hand. "We will still live many years," said he, "to preserve to the world such specimens of its rarest men. Trust yourself to me, my friend. We have no reply from D'Artagnan; that is a good sign. He must have given orders to get the vessels together and clear the sea. On my part, I have just issued directions that a bark should be rolled on rollers to the mouth of the great cavern of Locmaria, which you know, where we have so often lain in wait for the foxes." "Yes, and which terminates at the little creek by a trench, where we discovered the day that splendid fox escaped that way." "Precisely. In case of misfortunes, a bark is to be concealed for us in that cavern. Indeed, it must be there by this time. We will wait for a favorable moment, and during the night we will go to sea." "That is a grand idea. What shall we gain by it?" "We shall gain this. Nobody knows that grotto, or rather its issue, except ourselves and 2 or 3 hunters of the island. We shall gain this, that if the island is occupied, the scouts, seeing no bark upon the shore, will never imagine we can escape, and will cease to watch." "I understand." "Well, that weakness in the legs? Oh, better, much, just now. You see, then, plainly, that everything conspires to give us quietude and hope. D'Artagnan will sweep the sea and leave us free. No royal fleet or descent to be dreaded. Vive Dieu! Porthos, we have still half a century of magnificent adventure before us. And if I once touch Spanish ground, I swear to you, added the bishop with terrible energy, that your brevet of duke is not such a chance as it is said to be. We live by hope, said Porthos, enlivened by the warmth of his companion. All at once a cry resounded in their ears. To arms! To arms! This cry, repeated by 100 throats, piercing the chamber where the two friends were conversing, carried surprise to one, and uneasiness to the other. Aramis opened the window. He saw a crowd of people running with flambeaux. Women were seeking places of safety. The armed population were hastening to their posts. "The fleet! The fleet!" cried a soldier, who recognized Aramis. "The fleet?" repeated the latter. "Within half cannon shot," continued the soldier. "To arms!" cried Aramis. "To arms!" repeated Porthos formidably, and both rushed forth towards the mole to place themselves within the shelter of the batteries. Boats laden with soldiers were seen approaching, and in 3 directions, for the purpose of landing at 3 points at once. "What must be done?" said an officer of the guard. "Stop them, and if they persist, fire," said Aramis. 5 minutes later the cannonade commenced. These were the shots that D'Artagnan had heard as he landed in France. But the boats were too near the mole to allow the cannon to aim correctly. They landed, and the combat commenced, hand to hand. "What's the matter, Porthos?" said Aramis to his friend. "Nothing, nothing, only my legs. It is really incomprehensible. They will be better when we charge." In fact, Porthos and Aramis did charge with such vigor, and so thoroughly animated their men, that the royalists re-embarked precipitately, without gaining anything but the wounds they carried away. "Eh, but Porthos!" cried Aramis, "we must have a prisoner, quick, quick!" Porthos bent over the stair of the mole, and seized by the nape of the neck one of the officers of the royal army who was waiting to embark till all his people should be in the boat. The arm of the giant lifted up his prey, which served him as a buckler, and he recovered himself without a shot being fired at him. "Here is a prisoner for you," said Porthos coolly to Aramis. "Well," cried the latter, laughing, "did you not calumniate your legs?" "It was not with my legs I captured him," said Porthos. "It was with my arms." End of chapter. The Man in the Iron Mask, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 46. The Son of Biscarat. The Bretons of the Isle were very proud of this victory. Aramis did not encourage them in the feeling. "What will happen," said he to Porthos, when everybody was gone home, "will be that the anger of the king will be roused by the account of the resistance, and that these brave people will be decimated or shot when they are taken, which cannot fail to take place." "From which it results, then," said Porthos, "that what we have done is of not the slightest use." "For the moment, it may be," replied the bishop, "for we have a prisoner from whom we shall learn what our enemies are preparing to do." "Yes, let us interrogate the prisoner," said Porthos, "and the means of making him speak are very simple. We are going to supper. We will invite him to join us. As he drinks, he will talk." This was done. The officer was at first rather uneasy, but became reassured on seeing what sort of men he had to deal with. He gave, without having any fear of compromising himself, all the details imaginable of the resignation and departure of D'Artagnan. He explained how, after that departure, the new leader of the expedition had ordered a surprise upon Belle Isle. There his explanation stopped. Aramis and Porthos exchanged a glance that evinced their despair. No more dependence to be placed now on D'Artagnan's fertile imagination, no further resource in the event of defeat.
Aramis, continuing his interrogations, asked the prisoner what the leaders of the expedition contemplated doing with the leaders of Belle Isle. "The orders are," replied he, "to kill during combat, or hang afterwards." Porthos and Aramis looked at each other again, and the color mounted to their faces. "I am too light for the gallows," replied Aramis. "People like me are not hung."
"And I am too heavy," said Porthos. "People like me break the cord."
"I am sure," said the prisoner, gallantly, "that we could have guaranteed you the exact kind of death you preferred."
"1,000 thanks,"
said Aramis, seriously. Porthos bowed.
"One more cup of wine to your health,"
said he, drinking himself. From one subject to another the chat with the officer was prolonged. He was an intelligent gentleman, and suffered himself to be led on by the charm of Aramis's wit and Porthos's cordial bonhomie. "Pardon me," said he, "if I address a question to you, but men who are in their sixth bottle have a clear right to forget themselves a little."
"Address it!" cried Porthos. "Address it!"
"Speak," said Aramis. "Were you not, gentlemen, both in the musketeers of the late king?"
"Yes, monsieur, and amongst the best of them, if you please," said Porthos.
"That is true. I should say even the best of all soldiers, messieurs, if I did not fear to offend the memory of my father."
"Of your father?"
cried Aramis. "Do you know what my name is?"
"Ma foi! No, monsieur, but you can tell us, and—"
"I am called Georges de Biscarrat."
"Oh!"
cried Porthos, in his turn.
"Biscarrat! Do you remember that name, Aramis?"
"Biscarrat," reflected the bishop.
"It seems to me—"
"Try to recollect, monsieur," said the officer.
"Pardieu, that won't take me long," said Porthos. "Biscarrat, called Cardinal, one of the four who interrupted us on the day on which we formed our friendship with D'Artagnan, sword in hand."
"Precisely, gentlemen."
"The only one," cried Aramis, eagerly, "we could not scratch."
"Consequently, a capital blade," said the prisoner.
"That's true, most true,"
exclaimed both friends together.
"Ma foi! Monsieur Biscarrat, we are delighted to make the acquaintance of such a brave man's son."
Biscarrat pressed the hands held out by the two musketeers. Aramis looked at Porthos as much as to say,
"Here is a man who will help us."
And without delay,
"Confess, monsieur," said he, "that it is good to have once been a good man."
"My father always said so, monsieur."
"Confess likewise that it is a sad circumstance in which you find yourself, a falling in with men destined to be shot or hung, and to learn that these men are old acquaintances, in fact, hereditary friends."
"Oh, you are not reserved for such a frightful fate as that, messieurs and friends," said the young man, warmly.
"Bah! You said so yourself."
"I said so just now, when I did not know you; but now that I know you, I say, you will evade this dismal fate if you wish."
"How, if we wish?"
echoed Aramis, whose eyes beamed with intelligence as he looked alternately at the prisoner and Porthos.
"Provided,"
continued Porthos, looking in his turn with noble intrepidity at M. Biscarrat and the bishop,
"provided nothing disgraceful be required of us."
"Nothing at all will be required of you, gentlemen," replied the officer. "What should they ask of you? If they find you, they will kill you; that is a predetermined thing. Try, then, gentlemen, to prevent their finding you."
"I don't think I am mistaken," said Porthos, with dignity, "but it appears evident to me that if they want to find us, they must come and seek us here."
"In that you are perfectly right, my worthy friend," replied Aramis, constantly consulting with his looks the countenance of Biscarrat, who had grown silent and constrained.
"You wish, Monsieur de Biscarrat, to say something to us, to make us some overture, and you dare not.
Is that true?" "Ah, gentlemen and friends, it is because by speaking I betray the watchword. But hark! I hear a voice that frees mine by dominating it."
"Cannon!"
said Porthos.
"Cannon and musketry, too!"
cried the bishop. On hearing at a distance, among the rocks, these sinister reports of a combat which they thought had ceased.
"What can that be?"
asked Porthos.
"Eh, pardieu!" cried Aramis. "That is just what I expected." "What is that?"
"That the attack made by you was nothing but a feint. Is that not true, monsieur? And whilst your companions allowed themselves to be repulsed, you were certain of effecting a landing on the other side of the island." "Oh, several, monsieur."
"We are lost, then," said the bishop of Vannes, quietly.
"Lost! That is possible," replied the Seigneur de Pierrefonds; "but we are not taken or hung." And so saying, he rose from the table, went to the wall, and coolly took down his sword and pistols, which he examined with the care of an old soldier who is preparing for battle, and who feels that life, in a great measure, depends upon the excellence and right conditions of his arms. At the report of the cannon, at the news of the surprise which might deliver up the island to the royal troops, the terrified crowd rushed precipitately to the fort to demand assistance and advice from their leaders. Aramis, pale and downcast, between two flambeaux, showed himself at the window which looked into the principal court, full of soldiers waiting for orders, and bewildered inhabitants imploring succor.
"My friends,"
said D'Herblay in a grave and sonorous voice,
"Monsieur Fouquet, your protector, your friend, your father, has been arrested by an order of the king and thrown into the Bastille."
A sustained yell of vengeful fury came floating up to the window at which the bishop stood, and enveloped him in a magnetic field.
"Avenge Monsieur Fouquet!" cried the most excited of his hearers. "Death to the royalists!"
"No, my friends," replied Aramis, solemnly. "No, my friends, no resistance. The king is master in his kingdom. The king is the mandatory of God. The king and God have struck Monsieur Fouquet. Humble yourselves before the hand of God. Love God and the king, who have struck Monsieur Fouquet. But do not avenge your seigneur. Do not think of avenging him. You would sacrifice yourselves in vain. You, your wives and children, your property, your liberty. Lay down your arms, my friends, lay down your arms, since the king commands you so to do, and retire peaceably to your dwellings. It is I who ask you to do so. It is I who beg you to do so. It is I who now, in the hour of need, command you to do so, in the name of Monsieur Fouquet." The crowd collected under the window uttered a prolonged roar of anger and terror. "The soldiers of Louis XIV. Have reached the island," continued Aramis. "From this time it would no longer be a fight betwixt them and you, it would be a massacre. Begone, then, begone and forget. This time I command you, in the name of the Lord of hosts." The mutineers retired slowly, submissive, silent. "Ah! What have you just been saying, my friend?" said Porthos. "Monsieur," said Biscarrat to the bishop, "you may save all these inhabitants, but thus you will neither save yourself nor your friend." "Monsieur de Biscarrat," said the bishop of Vannes, with a singular accent of nobility and courtesy, "Monsieur de Biscarrat, be kind enough to resume your liberty." "I am very willing to do so, monsieur, but—" "That would render us a service, for when announcing to the king's lieutenant the submission of the islanders, you will perhaps obtain some grace for us on informing him of the manner in which that submission has been effected." "Grace!" replied Porthos with flashing eyes. "What is the meaning of that word?" Aramis touched the elbow of his friend roughly, as he had been accustomed to do in the days of their youth, when he wanted to warn Porthos that he had committed, or was about to commit, a blunder. Porthos understood him, and was silent immediately. "I will go, messieurs," replied Biscarrat, a little surprised likewise at the word grace pronounced by the haughty musketeer, of and to whom, but a few minutes before, he had related with so much enthusiasm the heroic exploits with which his father had delighted him. "Go, then, Monsieur Biscarrat," said Aramis, bowing to him, "and at parting receive the expression of our entire gratitude." "But you, monsieur, you whom I think it is an honor to call my friends, since you have been willing to accept that title, what will become of you in the meantime?" replied the officer, very much agitated at taking leave of the two ancient adversaries of his father.
"We will wait here."
"But, mon Dieu, the order is precise and formal."
"I am Bishop of Vannes, Monsieur de Biscarrat, and they no more shoot a bishop than they hang a gentleman."
"Ah, yes, monsieur, yes, monseigneur," replied Biscarrat. "It is true, you are right. There is still that chance for you. Then I will depart. I will repair to the commander of the expedition, the king's lieutenant. Adieu, then, messieurs, or rather, to meet again, I hope." The worthy officer, jumping upon a horse given him by Aramis, departed in the direction of the sound of cannon, which, by surging the crowd into the fort, had interrupted the conversation of the two friends with their prisoner. Aramis watched the departure, and when left alone with Porthos, "Well, do you comprehend?" said he.
"Ma foi, no!" "Did not Biscarrat inconvenience you here?"
"No, he is a brave fellow."
"Yes, but the grotto of Locmaria, is it necessary all the world should know it?"
"Ah, that is true, that is true, I comprehend. We are going to escape by the cavern."
"If you please," cried Aramis, gaily. "Forward, friend Porthos, our boat awaits us. King Louis has not caught us yet."
End of chapter. The Man in the Iron Mask, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 47. The Grotto of Locmaria. The cavern of Locmaria was sufficiently distant from the mole to render it necessary for our friends to husband their strength in order to reach it. Besides, night was advancing; midnight had struck at the fort. Porthos and Aramis were loaded with money and arms. They walked, then, across the heath, which stretched between the mole and the cavern, listening to every noise, in order better to avoid an ambush. From time to time, on the road which they had carefully left on their left, passed fugitives coming from the interior, at the news of the landing of the royal troops. Aramis and Porthos, concealed behind some projecting mass of rock, collected the words that escaped from the poor people, who fled trembling, carrying with them their most valuable effects, and tried, whilst listening to their complaints, to gather something from them for their own interest. At length, after a rapid race, frequently interrupted by prudent stoppages, they reached the deep grottos, in which the prophetic Bishop of Vannes had taken care to have secreted a bark capable of keeping the sea at this fine season.
"My good friend," said Porthos, panting vigorously, "we have arrived, it seems. But I thought you spoke of 3 men, 3 servants, who were to accompany us. I don't see them. Where are they?"
"Why should you see them, Porthos?" replied Aramis. "They are certainly waiting for us in the cavern, and, no doubt, are resting, having accomplished their rough and difficult task."
Aramis stopped Porthos, who was preparing to enter the cavern.
"Will you allow me, my friend," said he to the giant, "to pass in first? I know the signal I have given to these men, who, not hearing it, would be very likely to fire upon you or slash away with their knives in the dark."
"Go on, then, Aramis, go on. Go first. You impersonate wisdom and foresight. Go. Ah, there is that fatigue again, of which I spoke to you. It has just seized me afresh."
Aramis left Porthos sitting at the entrance of the grotto, and bowing his head, he penetrated into the interior of the cavern, imitating the cry of the owl. A little plaintive cooing, a scarcely distinct echo, replied from the depths of the cave. Aramis pursued his way cautiously, and soon was stopped by the same kind of cry as he had first uttered, within 10 paces of him. "Are you there, Yves?" said the bishop.
"Yes, monseigneur. Goenne is here likewise. His son accompanies us."
"That is well. Are all things ready?"
"Yes, monseigneur."
"Go to the entrance of the grottos, my good Yves, and you will there find the Seigneur de Pierrefonds, who is resting after the fatigue of our journey; and if he should happen not to be able to walk, lift him up and bring him hither to me." The 3 men obeyed, but the recommendation given to his servants was superfluous. Porthos, refreshed, had already commenced the descent, and his heavy step resounded amongst the cavities, formed and supported by columns of porphyry and granite. As soon as the Seigneur de Bracieux had rejoined the bishop, the Bretons lighted a lantern with which they were furnished, and Porthos assured his friend that he felt as strong again as ever. "Let us inspect the boat," said Aramis, "and satisfy ourselves at once what it will hold."
"Do not go too near with the light," said the patron Yves, "for as you desired me, monseigneur, I have placed under the bench of the poop, in the coffer you know of, the barrel of powder, and the musket charges that you sent me from the fort."
"Very well," said Aramis, and taking the lantern himself, he examined minutely all parts of the canoe, with the precautions of a man who is neither timid nor ignorant in the face of danger. The canoe was long, light, drawing little water, thin of keel; in short, one of those that have always been so aptly built at Belle Isle, a little high in its sides, solid upon the water, very manageable, furnished with planks which, in uncertain weather, formed a sort of deck over which the waves might glide, so as to protect the rowers. In 2 well-closed coffers, placed beneath the benches of the prow and the poop, Aramis found bread, biscuit, dried fruits, a quarter of bacon, a good provision of water in leathern bottles, the whole forming rations sufficient for people who did not mean to quit the coast, and would be able to revictual if necessity commanded. The arms, 8 muskets, and as many horse pistols, were in good condition, and all loaded. There were additional oars, in case of accident, and that little sail called trinquet, which assists the speed of the canoe at the same time the boatmen row, and is so useful when the breeze is slack. When Aramis had seen to all these things, and appeared satisfied with the results of his inspection, "Let us consult Porthos," said he, "to know if we must endeavor to get the boat out by the unknown extremity of the grotto, following the descent and the shade of the cavern, or whether it be better, in the open air, to make it slide upon its rollers through the bushes, leveling the road of the little beach, which is but 20 feet high, and gives at high tide 3 or 4 fathoms of good water upon a sound bottom."
"It must be as you please, monseigneur," replied the skipper Yves, respectfully; "but I don't believe that by the slope of the cavern, and in the dark in which we shall be obliged to maneuver our boat, the road will be so convenient as the open air. I know the beach well, and can certify that it is as smooth as a grass plot in a garden. The interior of the grotto, on the contrary, is rough, without reckoning, monseigneur, that at its extremity we shall come to the trench which leads into the sea, and perhaps the canoe will not pass down it."
"I have made my calculation," said the bishop, "and I am certain it will pass."
"So be it. I wish it may, monseigneur," continued Yves; "but your highness knows very well that to make it reach the extremity of the trench, there is an enormous stone to be lifted, that under which the fox always passes, and which closes the trench like a door."
"It can be raised," said Porthos. "That is nothing."
"Oh, I know that monseigneur has the strength of 10 men," replied Yves, "but that is giving him a great deal of trouble."
I think the skipper may be right," said Aramis. "Let us try the open air passage."
"The more so, monseigneur," continued the fisherman, "that we should not be able to embark before day. It will require so much labor, and that as soon as daylight appears, a good vedette placed outside the grotto would be necessary, indispensable even, to watch the maneuvers of the lighters or cruisers that are on the lookout for us."
"Yes, yes, Yves, your reasons are good. We will go by the beach." And the three robust Bretons went to the boat, and were beginning to place their rollers underneath it to put it in motion, when the distant barking of dogs was heard, proceeding from the interior of the island. Aramis darted out of the grotto, followed by Porthos. Dawn just tinted with purple and white the waves and plain; through the dim light, melancholy fir trees waved their tender branches over the pebbles, and long flights of crows were skimming with their black wings the shimmering fields of buckwheat. In a quarter of an hour it would be clear daylight; the wakened birds announced it to all nature. The barkings which had been heard, which had stopped the three fishermen engaged in moving the boat, and had brought Aramis and Porthos out of the cavern, now seemed to come from a deep gorge within about a league of the grotto.
"It is a pack of hounds," said Porthos. "The dogs are on a scent."
"Who can be hunting at such a moment as this?" said Aramis.
"And this way particularly," continued Porthos, "where they might expect the army of the royalists."
The noise comes nearer.
"Yes, you are right, Porthos, the dogs are on a scent. But Yves," cried Aramis, "come here, come here."
Yves ran toward him, letting fall the cylinder which he was about to place under the boat when the bishop's call interrupted him.
"What is the meaning of this hunt, skipper?" said Porthos.
"Eh, monseigneur, I cannot understand it," replied the Breton. "It is not at such a moment that the Seigneur de Locmaria would hunt. No, and yet the dogs—"
"Unless they have escaped from the kennel."
"No," said Goenne, "they are not the Seigneur de Locmaria's hounds." "In common prudence," said Aramis, "let us go back into the grotto. The voices evidently draw nearer. We shall soon know what we have to trust to." They re entered, but had scarcely proceeded 100 steps in the darkness, when a noise like the hoarse sigh of a creature in distress resounded through the cavern, and breathless, rapid, terrified, a fox passed like a flash of lightning before the fugitives, leaped over the boat, and disappeared, leaving behind its sour scent, which was perceptible for several seconds under the low vaults of the cave.
"The fox!"
cried the Bretons, with the glad surprise of born hunters.
"Accursed mischance!" cried the bishop. "Our retreat is discovered." "How so?" said Porthos. "Are you afraid of a fox?"
"Eh? My friend, what do you mean by that? Why do you specify the fox? It is not the fox alone.
Pardieu! But don't you know, Porthos, that after the foxes come hounds, and after hounds, men?"
Porthos hung his head. As though to confirm the words of Aramis, they heard the yelping pack approach with frightful swiftness upon the trail. 6 foxhounds burst at once upon the little heath, with mingling yelps of triumph.
"There are the dogs, plain enough,"
said Aramis, posted on the lookout behind a chink in the rocks.
"Now, who are the huntsmen?"
"If it is the Seigneur de Locmaria's," replied the sailor, "he will leave the dogs to hunt the grotto, for he knows them, and will not enter in himself, being quite sure that the fox will come out the other side. It is there he will wait for him."
"It is not the Seigneur de Locmaria who is hunting," replied Aramis, turning pale in spite of his efforts to maintain a placid countenance.
"Who is it, then?"
said Porthos.
"Look."
Porthos applied his eye to the slit, and saw at the summit of a hillock a dozen horsemen urging on their horses in the track of the dogs, shouting,
"Taillot! Taillot!"
"The guards!" said he. "Yes, my friend, the king's guards."
"The king's guards, do you say, monseigneur?" cried the Bretons, growing pale in turn.
"With Biscarrat at their head, mounted upon my grey horse," continued Aramis. The hounds at the same moment rushed into the grotto like an avalanche, and the depths of the cavern were filled with their deafening cries.
"Ah, the devil!"
said Aramis, resuming all his coolness at the sight of this certain, inevitable danger.
"I am perfectly satisfied we are lost, but we have at least one chance left. If the guards who follow their hounds happen to discover there is an issue to the grotto, there is no help for us, for on entering they must see both ourselves and our boat. The dogs must not go out of the cavern. Their masters must not enter." "That is clear," said Porthos. "You understand," added Aramis, with the rapid precision of command. "There are 6 dogs that will be forced to stop at the great stone under which the fox has glided, but at the too narrow opening of which they must be themselves stopped and killed."
The Bretons sprang forward, knife in hand. In a few minutes there was a lamentable concert of angry barks and mortal howls, and then silence.
"That's well," said Aramis, coolly. "Now for the masters."
"What is to be done with them?" said Porthos.
"Wait their arrival, conceal ourselves, and kill them."
"Kill them!" replied Porthos.
"There are 16," said Aramis, "at least at present."
"And well armed,"
added Porthos, with a smile of consolation.
"It will last about 10 minutes," said Aramis. "To work!"
And with a resolute air he took up a musket and placed a hunting knife between his teeth.
"Yves, Goenne, and his son," continued Aramis, "will pass the muskets to us. You, Porthos, will fire when they are close. We shall have brought down, at the lowest computation, 8 before the others are aware of anything. That is certain. Then all, there are 5 of us, will dispatch the other 8, knife in hand."
"And poor Biscarrat?"
said Porthos.
Aramis reflected a moment.
"Biscarrat first," replied he, coolly. "He knows us."
End of chapter. The Man in the Iron Mask, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 48. The Grotto. In spite of the sort of divination which was the remarkable side of the character of Aramis, the event, subject to the risks of things over which uncertainty presides, did not fall out exactly as the Bishop of Vannes had foreseen. Biscarrat, better mounted than his companions, arrived first at the opening of the grotto, and comprehended that fox and hounds were one and all engulfed in it. Only, struck by that superstitious terror which every dark and subterraneous way naturally impresses upon the mind of man, he stopped at the outside of the grotto, and waited till his companions should have assembled round him. "Well," asked the young men, coming up out of breath, and unable to understand the meaning of this inaction. "Well, I cannot hear the dogs. They and the fox must all be lost in this infernal cavern." "They were too close up," said one of the guards, "to have lost scent all at once. Besides, we should hear them from one side or another. They must, as Biscarrat say, be in this grotto." "But then," said one of the young men, "why don't they give tongue?" "It is strange," muttered another. "Well, but," said a fourth, "let us go into this grotto." "Does it happen to be forbidden we should enter it?" "No," replied Biscarrat. "Only, as it looks as dark as a wolf's mouth, we might break our necks in it." "Witness the dogs," said a guard, "who seem to have broken theirs." "What the devil can have become of them?" asked the young men in chorus; and every master called his dog by his name, whistled to him in his favorite mode, without a single one replying to either call or whistle. "It is perhaps an enchanted grotto," said Biscarrat. "Let us see." And jumping from his horse, he made a step into the grotto. Stop, stop, I will accompany you, said one of the guards, on seeing Biscarrat disappear in the shades of the cavern's mouth. No, replied Biscarrat, there must be something extraordinary in the place. Don't let us risk ourselves all at once. If in 10 minutes you do not hear of me, you can come in, but not all at once. Be it so, said the young man, who, besides, did not imagine that Biscarrat ran much risk in the enterprise. We will wait for you. And without dismounting from their horses, they formed a circle round the grotto. Biscarrat entered then alone, and advanced through the darkness till he came in contact with the muzzle of Porthos's musket. The resistance which his chest met with astonished him. He naturally raised his hand and laid hold of the icy barrel. At the same instant, Yves lifted a knife against the young man, who was about to fall upon him with all the force of a Breton's arm, when the iron wrist of Porthos stopped it halfway. Then, like low muttering thunder, his voice growled in the darkness, "I will not have him killed." Biscarrat found himself between a protection and a threat, the one almost as terrible as the other. However brave the young man might be, he could not prevent a cry escaping him, which Aramis immediately suppressed by placing a handkerchief over his mouth. "Monsieur de Biscarrat," said he, in a low voice, "we mean you no harm, and you must know that if you have recognized us, but at the first word, the first groan, the first whisper, we shall be forced to kill you as we have killed your dogs." "Yes, I recognize you, gentlemen," said the officer in a low voice. "But why are you here? What are you doing here? Unfortunate men, I thought you were in the fort." "And you, monsieur, you were to obtain conditions for us, I think." "I did all I was able, messieurs, but—" "But what?" "But there are positive orders." "To kill us?" Biscarrat made no reply. It would have cost him too much to speak of the cord to gentlemen. Aramis understood the silence of the prisoner. "Monsieur Biscarrat," said he, "you would be already dead if we had not regard for your youth and our ancient association with your father, but you may yet escape from the place by swearing that you will not tell your companions what you have seen." "I will not only swear that I will not speak of it," said Biscarrat, "but I still further swear that I will do everything in the world to prevent my companions from setting foot in the grotto." "Biscarrat! Biscarrat!" cried several voices from the outside, coming like a whirlwind into the cave. "Reply," said Aramis. "Here I am!" cried Biscarrat. "Now begone, we depend on your loyalty." And he left his hold of the young man, who hastily returned towards the light. "Biscarrat! Biscarrat!" cried the voices, still nearer, and the shadows of several human forms projected into the interior of the grotto. Biscarrat rushed to meet his friends in order to stop them, and met them just as they were adventuring into the cave. Aramis and Porthos listened with the intense attention of men whose life depends upon a breath of air. "Oh, oh!" exclaimed one of the guards, as he came to the light, "how pale you are!" "Pale!" cried another. "You ought to say corpse color." "Ay!" said the young man, endeavoring to collect his faculties. "In the name of heaven, what has happened?" exclaimed all the voices. "You have not a drop of blood in your veins, my poor friend," said one of them, laughing. "Messieurs, it is nothing." "Messieurs, it is serious," said another. "He is going to faint. Does any one of you happen to have any salts?" And they all laughed. This hail of jests fell round Biscarrat's ears like musket balls in a melee. He recovered himself amidst a deluge of interrogations. "What do you suppose I have seen?" asked he. "I was too hot when I entered the grotto, and I have been struck with a chill. That is all." "But the dogs, the dogs, have you seen them again? Did you see anything of them? Do you know anything about them?" "I suppose they have got out some other way." Messieurs, said one of the young men, there is in that which is going on, in the paleness and silence of our friend, a mystery which Biscarrat will not or cannot reveal. Only, and this is certain, Biscarrat has seen something in the grotto. Well, for my part, I am very curious to see what it is, even if it is the devil. To the grotto, monsieur, to the grotto!
To the grotto!
Repeated all the voices, and the echo of the cavern carried like a menace to Porthos and Aramis. To the grotto! To the grotto! Biscarrat threw himself before his companions. Messieurs, messieurs, cried he, in the name of heaven, do not go in. Why, what is there so terrific in the cavern? Asked several at once. Come, speak, Biscarrat. Decidedly, it is the devil he has seen, repeated he who had before advanced that hypothesis. Well, said another, if he has seen him, he need not be selfish. He may as well let us have a look at him in turn. Messieurs, messieurs, I beseech you, urged Biscarrat. Nonsense! Let us pass. Messieurs, I implore you not to enter. Why? You went in yourself. Then one of the officers, who, of a riper age than the others, had till this time remained behind, and had said nothing, advanced. Messieurs, said he, with a calmness which contrasted with the animation of the young men, there is in there some person, or something, that is not the devil, but which, whatever it may be, has had sufficient power to silence our dogs. We must discover who this someone is, or what this something is. Biscarrat made a last effort to stop his friends, but it was useless. In vain he threw himself before the rashest, in vain he clung to the rocks to bar the passage. The crowd of young men rushed into the cave, in the steps of the officer who had spoken last, but who had sprung in first, sword in hand, to face the unknown danger. Biscarrat, repulsed by his friends, unable to accompany them, without passing in the eyes of Porthos and Aramis for a traitor and a perjurer, with painfully attentive ear and unconsciously supplicating hands, leaned against the rough side of a rock which he thought must be exposed to the fire of the musketeers. As to the guards, they penetrated further and further, with exclamations that grew fainter as they advanced. All at once, a discharge of musketry, growling like thunder, exploded in the entrails of the vault. 2 or 3 balls were flattened against the rock on which Biscarrat was leaning. At the same instant, cries, shrieks, imprecations burst forth, and the little troop of gentlemen reappeared, some pale, some bleeding, all enveloped in a cloud of smoke, which the outer air seemed to suck from the depths of the cavern. Biscarrat! Biscarrat! cried the fugitives. You knew there was an ambuscade in that cavern, and you did not warn us. Biscarrat, you are the cause that 4 of us are murdered men. Woe be to you, Biscarrat! You are the cause of my being wounded unto death, said one of the young men, letting a gush of scarlet lifeblood vomit in his palm, and spattering into Biscarrat's livid face. My blood be on your head! And he rolled in agony at the feet of the young man. But at least tell us who is there, cried several furious voices. Biscarrat remained silent. Tell us or die, cried the wounded man, raising himself upon one knee, and lifting towards his companion an arm bearing a useless sword. Biscarrat rushed towards him, opening his breast for the blow, but the wounded man fell back not to rise again, uttering a groan which was his last. Biscarrat, with hair on end, haggard eyes, and bewildered head, advanced towards the interior of the cavern, saying, You are right. Death to me, who have allowed my comrades to be assassinated. I am a worthless wretch. And throwing away his sword, for he wished to die without defending himself, he rushed head foremost into the cavern. The others followed him. The 11 who remained out of 16 imitated his example, but they did not go further than the first. a second discharge laid 5 upon the icy sand, and as it was impossible to see whence this murderous thunder issued, the others fell back with a terror that can be better imagined than described. But far from flying, as the others had done, Biscarrat remained safe and sound, seated on a fragment of rock, and waited. There were only 6 gentlemen left. "Seriously," said one of the survivors, "is it the devil?" "Ma foi, it is much worse," said another. "Ask Biscarrat, he knows." "Where is Biscarrat?" The young men looked round them, and saw that Biscarrat did not answer. "He is dead," said 2 or 3 voices. "Oh, no," replied another. "I saw him through the smoke, sitting quietly on a rock. He is in the cavern. He is waiting for us." "He must know who are there." "And how should he know them?" "He was taken prisoner by the rebels." "That is true. Well, let us call him and learn from him whom we have to deal with." And all voices shouted, "Biscarrat! Biscarrat!" But Biscarrat did not answer. "Good," said the officer who had shown so much coolness in the affair. "We have no longer any need of him. Here are reinforcements coming." In fact, a company of guards, left in the rear by their officers, whom the ardor of the chase had carried away, from 75 to 80 men, arrived in good order, led by their captain and the first lieutenant. The 5 officers hastened to meet their soldiers, and, in language the eloquence of which may be easily imagined, they related the adventure and asked for aid. The captain interrupted them. "Where are your companions?" demanded he. "Dead." "But there were 16 of you." "10 are dead. Biscarrat's in the cavern, and we are 5. "Biscarrat is a prisoner?" "Probably." "No, for here he is, look." In fact, Biscarrat appeared at the opening of the grotto. "He is making a sign to come on," said the officer. "Come on." "Come on!" cried all the troop, and they advanced to meet Biscarrat. "Monsieur," said the captain, addressing Biscarrat, "I am assured that you know who the men are in that grotto, and who make such a desperate defense. In the king's name I command you to declare what you know." "Captain," said Biscarrat, "you have no need to command me. My word has been restored to me this very instant, and I came in the name of these men." "To tell me who they are?" "To tell you they are determined to defend themselves to the death, unless you grant them satisfactory terms." "How many are there of them, then?" "There are 2," said Biscarrat. "There are 2, and want to impose conditions upon us?" "There are 2, and they have already killed 10 of our men." "What sort of people are they? Giants?" "Worse than that. Do you remember the history of the Bastion Saint Gervais, captain?" "Yes, where 4 musketeers held out against an army." "Well, these are 2 of those same musketeers." "And their names?" "At that period, they were called Porthos and Aramis. Now they are styled M. d'Herblay and M. du Vallon." "And what interest have they in all this?" "It is they who were holding Belle Isle for M. Fouquet." A murmur ran through the ranks of the soldiers on hearing the 2 words, Porthos and Aramis. "The musketeers! The musketeers!" repeated they. And among all these brave men, the idea that they were going to have a struggle against 2 of the oldest glories of the French army, made a shiver, half enthusiasm, 2/3 terror, run through them. In fact, those 4 names, D'Artagnan, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, were venerated among all who wore a sword, as, in antiquity, the names of Hercules, Theseus, Castor, and Pollux were venerated. "2 men, and they have killed 10 in 2 discharges. It is impossible, Monsieur Biscarrat." "Eh, captain?" replied the latter.
I do not tell you that they have not with them 2 or 3 men, as the musketeers of the bastion Saint Gervais had 2 or 3 lackeys. But believe me, captain, I have seen these men. I have been taken prisoner by them. I know they themselves alone are all sufficient to destroy an army."
"That we shall see," said the captain, "and that in a moment, too. Gentlemen, attention!" At this reply, no one stirred, and all prepared to obey. Biscarrat alone risked a last attempt. "Monsieur," said he, in a low voice, "be persuaded by me. Let us pass on our way. Those 2 men, those 2 lions you are going to attack, will defend themselves to the death. They have already killed 10 of our men. They will kill double the number, and end by killing themselves rather than surrender. What shall we gain by fighting them?" "We shall gain the consciousness, monsieur, of not having allowed 80 of the king's guards to retire before 2 rebels. If I listened to your advice, monsieur, I should be a dishonored man, and by dishonoring myself I should dishonor the army. Forward, my men!" And he marched first as far as the opening of the grotto. There he halted. The object of this halt was to give Biscarrat and his companions time to describe to him the interior of the grotto. Then, when he believed he had a sufficient acquaintance with the place, he divided his company into 3 bodies, which were to enter successively, keeping up a sustained fire in all directions. No doubt, in this attack they would lose 5 more, perhaps 10, but certainly they must end by taking the rebels, since there was no issue, and at any rate 2 men could not kill 80. "Captain," said Biscarrat, "I beg to be allowed to march at the head of the first platoon." "So be it," replied the captain. "You have all the honor. I make you a present of it." "Thanks," replied the young man, with all the firmness of his race. "Take your sword, then." "I shall go as I am, captain," said Biscarrat, "for I do not go to kill, I go to be killed." And placing himself at the head of the first platoon, with head uncovered and arms crossed, "March, gentlemen," said he. End of chapter.
The Man in the Iron Mask, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 49. An Homeric Song. It is time to pass to the other camp, and to describe at once the combatants and the field of battle. Aramis and Porthos had gone to the grotto of Locmaria with the expectation of finding there their canoe, ready armed, as well as the 3 Bretons, their assistants; and they at first hoped to make the bark pass through the little issue of the cavern, concealing in that fashion both their labors and their flight. The arrival of the fox and dogs obliged them to remain concealed. The grotto extended the space of about 100 toises, to that little slope dominating a creek. Formerly a temple of the Celtic divinities, when Belle Isle was still called Chalonese, this grotto had beheld more than one human sacrifice accomplished in its mystic depths. The first entrance to the cavern was by a moderate descent, above which distorted rocks formed a weird arcade. The interior, very uneven and dangerous from the inequalities of the vault, was subdivided into several compartments, which communicated with each other by means of rough and jagged steps, fixed right and left, in uncouth natural pillars. At the 3rd compartment the vault was so low, the passage so narrow, that the bark would scarcely have passed without touching the side. Nevertheless, in moments of despair, wood softens, and stone grows flexible beneath the human will. Such was the thought of Aramis, when, after having fought the fight, he decided upon flight, a flight most dangerous, since all the assailants were not dead, and that, admitting the possibility of putting the bark to sea, they would have to fly in open day, before the conquered, so interested on recognizing their small number, in pursuing their conquerors. When the 2 discharges had killed 10 men, Aramis, familiar with the windings of the cavern, went to reconnoiter them one by one, and counted them,
for the smoke prevented seeing outside, and he immediately commanded that the canoe should be rolled as far as the great stone, the closure of the liberating issue. Porthos collected all his strength, took the canoe in his arms, and raised it up, whilst the Bretons made it run rapidly along the rollers. They had descended into the third compartment. They had arrived at the stone which walled the outlet. Porthos seized this gigantic stone at its base, applied his robust shoulder, and gave a heave which made the wall crack. A cloud of dust fell from the vault, with the ashes of 10,000 generations of sea birds, whose nests stuck like cement to the rock. At the third shock, the stone gave way and oscillated for a minute. Porthos, placing his back against the neighboring rock, made an arch with his foot, which drove the block out of the calcareous masses which served for hinges and cramps. The stone fell, and daylight was visible, brilliant, radiant, flooding the cavern through the opening, and the blue sea appeared to the delighted Bretons. They began to lift the bark over the barricade. 20 more toises, and it would glide into the ocean. It was during this time that the company arrived, was drawn up by the captain, and disposed for either an escalade or an assault. Aramis watched over everything, to favor the labors of his friends. He saw the reinforcements, counted the men, and convinced himself at a single glance of the insurmountable peril to which fresh combat would expose them. To escape by sea, at the moment the cavern was about to be invaded, was impossible. In fact, the daylight which had just been admitted to the last compartments had exposed to the soldiers the bark being rolled towards the sea, the 2 rebels within musket shot, and one of their discharges would riddle the boat if it did not kill the navigators. Besides, allowing everything, if the bark escaped with the men on board of it, how could the alarm be suppressed? How could notice to the royal lighters be prevented? What could hinder the poor canoe, followed by sea and watched from the shore, from succumbing before the end of the day? Aramis, digging his hands into his gray hair with rage, invoked the assistance of God and the assistance of the demons. Calling to Porthos, who was doing more work than all the rollers, whether of flesh or wood, "My friend," said he, "our adversaries have just received a reinforcement." "Ah, ah," said Porthos quietly. "What is to be done, then?" "To recommence the combat," said Aramis, "is hazardous." "Yes," said Porthos, "for it is difficult to suppose that out of 2 one should not be killed, and certainly, if one of us was killed, the other would get himself killed also." Porthos spoke these words with that heroic nature which, with him, grew grander with necessity. Aramis felt it like a spur to his heart. "We shall neither of us be killed if you do what I tell you, friend Porthos." "Tell me what?" "These people are coming down into the grotto." "Yes." "We could kill about 15 of them, but no more." "How many are there in all?" asked Porthos. "They have received a reinforcement of 75 men." 75 and 5, 80. Ah!" sighed Porthos. "If they fire all at once, they will riddle us with balls." "Certainly they will." "Without reckoning," added Aramis, "that the detonation might occasion a collapse of the cavern." "Ay," said Porthos, "a piece of falling rock just now grazed my shoulder." "You see, then." "Oh, it is nothing." "We must determine upon something quickly. Our Bretons are going to continue to roll the canoe towards the sea." "Very well." "We 2 will keep the powder, the balls, and the muskets here." "But only 2, my dear Aramis. We shall never fire 3 shots together," said Porthos, innocently. "The defense by musketry is a bad one." "Find a better, then." "I have found one," said the giant, eagerly. "I will place myself in ambuscade behind the pillar with this iron bar, and invisible, unattackable. If they come in floods, I can let my bar fall upon their skulls 30 times in a minute. Hein, what do you think of the project?"
You smile."
"Excellent, dear friend, perfect. I approve it greatly. Only you will frighten them, and half of them will remain outside to take us by famine. What we want, my good friend, is the entire destruction of the troop. A single survivor encompasses our ruin."
"You are right, my friend; but how can we attract them, pray?"
"By not stirring, my good Porthos."
"Well, we won't stir, then; but when they are all together—"
"Then leave it to me. I have an idea."
"If it is so, and your idea proves a good one, and your idea is most likely to be good, I am satisfied."
"To your ambuscade, Porthos, and count how many enter."
"But you, what will you do?"
"Don't trouble yourself about me. I have a task to perform."
"I think I hear shouts."
"It is they. To your post. Keep within reach of my voice and hand." Porthos took refuge in the second compartment, which was in darkness, absolutely black. Aramis glided into the third. The giant held in his hand an iron bar of about 50 pounds weight. Porthos handled this lever, which had been used in rolling the bark, with marvelous facility. During this time, the Bretons had pushed the bark to the beach. In the further and lighter compartment, Aramis, stooping and concealed, was busy with some mysterious maneuver. A command was given in a loud voice. It was the last order of the captain commandant. 25 men jumped from the upper rocks into the first compartment of the grotto, and having taken their ground, began to fire. The echoes shrieked and barked. The hissing balls seemed actually to rarefy the air, and then opaque smoke filled the vault.
"To the left! To the left!"
cried Biscarrat, who in his first assault had seen the passage to the second chamber, and who, animated by the smell of powder, wished to guide his soldiers in that direction. The troop, accordingly, precipitated themselves to the left, the passage gradually growing narrower. Biscarrat, with his hands stretched forward, devoted to death, marched in advance of the muskets.
"Come on! Come on!" exclaimed he. "I see daylight."
"Strike, Porthos!" came the sepulchral voice of Aramis. Porthos breathed a heavy sigh, but he obeyed. The iron bar fell full and direct upon the head of Biscarrat, who was dead before he had ended his cry. Then the formidable lever rose 10 times in 10 seconds, and made 10 corpses. The soldiers could see nothing. They heard sighs and groans. They stumbled over dead bodies, but as they had no conception of the cause of all this, they came forward, jostling each other. The implacable bar, still falling, annihilated the first platoon, without a single sound to warn the second, which was quietly advancing. Only, commanded by the captain, the men had stripped a fir growing on the shore, and with its resinous branches twisted together, the captain had made a flambeau. On arriving at the compartment where Porthos, like the exterminating angel, had destroyed all he touched, the first rank drew back in terror. No firing had replied to that of the guards, and yet their way was stopped by a heap of dead bodies. They literally walked in blood. Porthos was still behind his pillar. The captain, illumining with trembling pine torch this frightful carnage, of which he in vain sought the cause, drew back towards the pillar behind which Porthos was concealed. Then a gigantic hand issued from the shade and fastened on the throat of the captain, who uttered a stifled rattle, his stretched out arms beating the air. The torch fell and was extinguished in blood. A second after, the corpse of the captain dropped close to the extinguished torch, and added another body to the heap of dead which blocked up the passage. All this was effected as mysteriously as though by magic. At hearing the rattling in the throat of the captain, the soldiers who accompanied him had turned round, caught a glimpse of his extended arms, his eyes starting from their sockets, and then the torch fell, and they were left in darkness. From an unreflective, instinctive, mechanical feeling, the lieutenant cried, "Fire!" Immediately a volley of musketry flamed, thundered, roared in the cavern, bringing down enormous fragments from the vaults. The cavern was lighted for an instant by this discharge,
and then immediately returned to pitchy darkness, rendered thicker by the smoke. To this succeeded a profound silence, broken only by the steps of the third brigade, now entering the cavern. End of chapter. The Man in the Iron Mask, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 50. The Death of a Titan. At the moment when Porthos, more accustomed to the darkness than these men coming from open daylight, was looking round him to see if through this artificial midnight Aramis were not making him some signal, he felt his arm gently touched, and a voice low as a breath murmured in his ear, "Come." "Oh!" said Porthos. "Hush!" said Aramis, if possible, yet more softly. And amidst the noise of the third brigade, which continued to advance, the imprecations of the guards still left alive, the muffled groans of the dying, Aramis and Porthos glided unseen along the granite walls of the cavern. Aramis led Porthos into the last but one compartment, and showed him, in a hollow of the rocky wall, a barrel of powder weighing from 70 to 80 pounds, to which he had just attached a fuse. "My friend," said he to Porthos, "you will take this barrel, the match of which I am going to set fire to, and throw it amidst our enemies. Can you do so?" "Parbleu!" replied Porthos, and he lifted the barrel with one hand. "Light it." "Stop," said Aramis, "till they are all massed together, and then, my Jupiter, hurl your thunderbolt among them." "Light it," repeated Porthos. "On my part," continued Aramis, "I will join our Bretons, and help them to get the canoe to the sea. I will wait for you on the shore, launch it strongly, and hasten to us." "Light it," said Porthos a third time. "But do you understand me?" "Parbleu!" said Porthos again, with laughter that he did not even attempt to restrain. "When a thing is explained to me, I understand it. Begone, and give me the light." Aramis gave the burning match to Porthos, who held out his arm to him, his hands being engaged. Aramis pressed the arm of Porthos with both his hands, and fell back to the outlet of the cavern, where the three rowers awaited him. Porthos, left alone, applied the spark bravely to the match. The spark, a feeble spark, first principle of conflagration, shone in the darkness like a glowworm, then was deadened against the match which it set fire to, Porthos enlivening the flame with his breath. The smoke was a little dispersed, and by the light of the sparkling match objects might, for 2 seconds, be distinguished. It was a brief but splendid spectacle, that of this giant, pale, bloody, his countenance lighted by the fire of the match burning in surrounding darkness. The soldiers saw him. They saw the barrel he held in his hand. They at once understood what was going to happen. Then these men, already choked with horror at the sight of what had been accomplished, filled with terror at the thought of what was about to be accomplished, gave out a simultaneous shriek of agony. Some endeavored to fly, but they encountered the third brigade, which barred their passage. Others mechanically took aim and attempted to fire their discharged muskets. Others fell instinctively upon their knees. 2 or 3 officers cried out to Porthos to promise him his liberty if he would spare their lives. The lieutenant of the third brigade commanded his men to fire, but the guards had before them their terrified companions, who served as a living rampart for Porthos. We have said that the light produced by the spark and the match did not last more than 2 seconds, but during these 2 seconds that is what it illumined. In the first place, the giant, enlarged in the darkness; then, at 10 paces off, a heap of bleeding bodies, crushed, mutilated, in the midst of which some still heaved in the last agony, lifting the mass as a last respiration, inflating the sides of some old monster dying in the night. Every breath of Porthos, thus vivifying the match, sent towards this heap of bodies a phosphorescent aura, mingled with streaks of purple. In addition to this principal group scattered about the grotto, as the chances of death or surprise had stretched them, isolated bodies seemed to be making ghastly exhibitions of their gaping wounds. Above ground, bedded in pools of blood, rose, heavy and sparkling, the short, thick pillars of the cavern, of which the strongly marked shades threw out the luminous particles. And all this was seen by the tremulous light of a match attached to a barrel of powder, that is to say, a torch which, whilst throwing a light on the dead past, showed death to come. As I have said, this spectacle did not last above 2 seconds. During this short space of time, an officer of the 3rd Brigade got together 8 men armed with muskets, and, through an opening, ordered them to fire upon Porthos. But they who received the order to fire trembled so that 3 guards fell by the discharge, and the 5 remaining balls hissed on to splinter the vault, plough the ground, or indent the pillars of the cavern. A burst of laughter replied to this volley, then the arm of the giant swung round, then was seen whirling through the air, like a falling star, the train of fire. The barrel, hurled a distance of 30 feet, cleared the barricade of dead bodies, and fell amidst a group of shrieking soldiers, who threw themselves on their faces. The officer had followed the brilliant train in the air. He endeavored to precipitate himself upon the barrel and tear out the match before it reached the powder it contained. Useless. The air had made the flame attached to the conductor more active. The match, which at rest might have burnt 5 minutes, was consumed in 30 seconds, and the infernal work exploded. Furious vortices of sulphur and nitre, devouring shoals of fire which caught every object, the terrible thunder of the explosion. This is what the second which followed disclosed in that cavern of horrors. The rocks split like planks of deal beneath the axe. A jet of fire, smoke, and debris sprang from the middle of the grotto, enlarging as it mounted. The large walls of silex tottered and fell upon the sand, and the sand itself, an instrument of pain when launched from its hard bed, riddled the faces with its myriad cutting atoms. Shrieks, imprecations, human life, dead bodies, all were engulfed in one terrific crash. The first 3 compartments became one sepulchral sink into which fell grimly back, in the order of their weight, every vegetable, mineral, or human fragment. Then the lighter sand and ash came down in turn, stretching like a winding sheet, and smoking over the dismal scene. And now, in this burning tomb, this subterranean volcano, seek the king's guards with their blue coats laced with silver. Seek the officers, brilliant in gold. Seek for the arms upon which they depended for their defense. One single man has made of all these things a chaos more confused, more shapeless, more terrible, than the chaos which existed before the creation of the world. There remained nothing of the 3 compartments, nothing by which God could have recognized his handiwork. As for Porthos, after having hurled the barrel of powder amidst his enemies, he had fled, as Aramis had directed him to do, and had gained the last compartment, into which air, light, and sunshine penetrated through the opening. Scarcely had he turned the angle which separated the 3rd compartment from the 4th, when he perceived at 100 paces from him the bark dancing on the waves. There were his friends, their liberty, their life and victory. 6 more of his formidable strides, and he would be out of the vault, out of the vault. A dozen of his vigorous leaps, and he would reach the canoe. Suddenly, he felt his knees give way. His knees seemed powerless, his legs to yield beneath him. "Oh, oh!" murmured he, "there is my weakness seizing me again. I can walk no further. What is this?" Aramis perceived him through the opening, and unable to conceive what could induce him to stop thus.
"Come on, Porthos, come on!" he cried. "Come quickly!"
"Oh!" replied the giant, making an effort that contorted every muscle of his body. "Oh, but I cannot!" While saying these words he fell upon his knees, but with his mighty hands he clung to the rocks and raised himself up again.
"Quick, quick!"
repeated Aramis, bending forward towards the shore, as if to draw Porthos towards him with his arms.
"Here I am,"
staggered Porthos, collecting all his strength to make one step more.
"In the name of Heaven! Porthos, make haste! The barrel will blow up!"
"Make haste, monseigneur!" shouted the Bretons to Porthos, who was floundering as in a dream. But there was no time. The explosion thundered, earth gaped, the smoke which hurled through the clefts obscured the sky, the sea flowed back as though driven by the blast of flame which darted from the grotto, as if from the jaws of some gigantic fiery chimera. The reflux took the bark out 20 toises. The solid rocks cracked to their base, and separated like blocks beneath the operation of the wedge. A portion of the vault was carried up towards heaven, as if it had been built of cardboard. The green and blue and topaz conflagration and black lava of liquefactions clashed and combated an instant beneath a majestic dome of smoke, then oscillated, declined, and fell successively the mighty monoliths of rock which the violence of the explosion had not been able to uproot from the bed of ages. They bowed to each other like grave and stiff old men, then, prostrating themselves, lay down forever in their dusty tomb. This frightful shock seemed to restore Porthos the strength that he had lost. He arose, a giant among granite giants. But at the moment he was flying between the double hedge of granite phantoms, these latter, which were no longer supported by the corresponding links, began to roll and totter round our Titan, who looked as if precipitated from heaven amidst rocks which he had just been launching. Porthos felt the very earth beneath his feet becoming jelly tremulous. He stretched both hands to repulse the falling rocks. A gigantic block was held back by each of his extended arms. He bent his head, and a third granite mass sank between his shoulders. For an instant, the power of Porthos seemed about to fail him, but this new Hercules united all his force, and the 2 walls of the prison in which he was buried fell back slowly and gave him place. For an instant he appeared, in this frame of granite, like the angel of chaos, but in pushing back the lateral rocks, he lost his point of support, for the monolith which weighed upon his shoulders, and the boulder, pressing upon him with all its weight, brought the giant down upon his knees. The lateral rocks, for an instant pushed back, drew together again, and added their weight to the ponderous mass which would have been sufficient to crush 10 men. The hero fell without a groan. He fell while answering Aramis with words of encouragement and hope, for, thanks to the powerful arch of his hands, for an instant he believed that, like Enceladus, he would succeed in shaking off the triple load. But by degrees Aramis beheld the block sink. The hands, strung for an instant, the arms stiffened for a last effort, gave way, the extended shoulders sank, wounded and torn, and the rocks continued to gradually collapse.
"Porthos! Porthos!" cried Aramis, tearing his hair. "Porthos, where are you? Speak!" "Here, here," murmured Porthos, with a voice growing evidently weaker. "Patience, patience." Scarcely had he pronounced these words when the impulse of the fall augmented the weight. The enormous rock sank down, pressed by those others which sank in from the sides, and, as it were, swallowed up Porthos in a sepulchre of badly jointed stones. On hearing the dying voice of his friend, Aramis had sprung to land. 2 of the Bretons followed him, with each a lever in his hand, one being sufficient to take care of the bark. The dying rattle of the valiant gladiator guided them amidst the ruins. Aramis, animated, active, and young as at 20, sprang towards the triple mass, and with his hands, delicate as those of a woman, raised by a miracle of strength the cornerstone of this great granite grave. Then he caught a glimpse, through the darkness of that charnel house, of the still brilliant eye of his friend, to whom the momentary lifting of the mass restored a momentary respiration.
The two men came rushing up, grasped their iron levers, united their triple strength, not merely to raise it, but sustain it. All was useless. They gave way with cries of grief, and the rough voice of Porthos, seeing them exhaust themselves in a useless struggle, murmured in an almost cheerful tone those supreme words which came to his lips with the last respiration: "Too heavy." After which his eyes darkened and closed, his face grew ashy pale, the hands whitened, and the colossus sank quite down, breathing his last sigh. With him sank the rock, which, even in his dying agony, he had still held up. The three men dropped the levers, which rolled upon the tumulary stone. Then, breathless, pale, his brow covered with sweat, Aramis listened, his breast oppressed, his heart ready to break. Nothing more. The giant slept the eternal sleep, in the sepulchre which God had built about him to his measure. End of chapter.